Welcome to the GBH studios at the Boston Public Library. We are broadcasting from the Newsfeed Cafe here at the library, live on YouTube, and with an in-person audience here. This afternoon's event was made possible by the GBH Forum Network and the Massachusetts Bicycle Association. I'm Jeremy Siegel. I'm the Global Transportation Correspondent and a news host at GBH, and I am honored to be moderating this panel discussion where we will go beyond the headlines and data and numbers surrounding traffic crashes ahead of MassBike's annual Day of Remembrance this weekend. Before I do introduce our first trio of guests, I want to talk a little bit about the numbers surrounding traffic. Here we see data of traffic fatalities over nearly the past half century, according to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. It's national data, and it breaks down the deaths of people inside vehicles, including trucks, cars, and buses, and deaths outside of vehicles. This includes pedestrians, bicycles, and motorcycles. And as you'll notice, the recent trend over the past more than 20 years is that roads, at least when it comes to fatalities, have gotten safer if you're inside of a vehicle, and if you're not, they've gotten less safe. Now let's take a look at what the data looks like for people riding bicycles nationally. Oh, here we actually have crash trends in Massachusetts. This is specifically looking at Massachusetts. This data comes from the State Transportation Department. It shows fatalities for both people on bikes and people walking. It's particularly striking when you zoom in on the past couple of years, when following 2020, when the pandemic led to most numbers going down, you see pedestrian deaths and serious injuries for cyclists and pedestrians going up over the past couple years. Next, let's look at one specific population that I think puts in perspective who is often killed by cars while walking in the Commonwealth. This graph comes from the advocacy group Walk Massachusetts, and it looks at fatalities by age on the road. Even though older adults over the age of 65 make up just 18% of the population, they make up a much larger piece of the population that dies on our roads. And I don't think it's a big leap to say that much of that probably comes from road design that simply does not make it safe for older adults in Massachusetts. With all of these numbers in mind, I now want to get to our discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our three panelists. For this first portion of the discussion, we'll focus on the personal loss behind some of the statistics that you just saw and the action that has come out of that loss. Over here we have Fatima Ali Salam, the head of the Mattapan Neighborhood Council, who is herself a survivor of traffic crashes. Fatima, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy.
We also have Alexa Gomberg, who is a student at MIT and an organizer whose roommate was the victim of a deadly crash. Alexa, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jeremy.
And also Eric Olson, a traffic safety activist and founder of the Sidney Mae Olson Fund, which is in memory of his 5-year-old daughter. Eric, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Jeremy.
I wanted to start with you, Eric. You're a resident of Andover, and you've become an advocate for road safety as a result of your personal loss. I'm sure it's a difficult story to recount, but if you could share what happened to your family.
Yeah, so we live downtown Andover, which is just sort of a quintessential New England town, right? Right by this intersection where a bunch of roads come together and there's shops and restaurants. And so we walk to town several times a day. We walk the dog, we meet friends, we walk to school. It's really sort of why we moved to Andover. And so on that day, my wife and daughter were walking to art class with my niece and my son. They were crossing an intersection that we've crossed many, many times. And there was a big semi-truck idling in the intersection. Went across with the walk sign, and the truck lurched forward, hit my daughter, killed her in the intersection. I wasn't there. I got a call, the nightmare call that no one wants to get. I was sitting debating some silly marketing messaging thing in my office, and my wife called, screaming a scream of like that I'd never heard from her, and she just said, "Sydney's dead. She got hit by a truck." And it was one of those moments. Moments later, I'm actually, ironically, sort of snarled in traffic on I-93 trying to get home. And it was a moment that I think about. There's a phenomenon where astronauts, when they go to space, they look at Earth and they see it and they feel fundamentally changed in some way because they see it from a completely different perspective. And for me, that was my astronaut moment where I really took for granted a lot of the world around me and felt that the systems were designed to protect me, protect my 5-year-old curly-haired daughter. And in that moment, that among many other things in my life was just completely shattered.
You've become an advocate for pedestrian safety in the aftermath of your daughter's death. What's your experience been trying to get people, and also specifically, state and local leaders, to listen when you're saying something needs to be done to make things safer?
Yeah, I think what I've realized, the biggest lesson I've learned over the last year is that these crashes are measured in a statistic. So my daughter shows up on something, it's just as one, right? But she was a smiley, giggly 5-year-old girl, and her crash left a crater in the community that has a ripple effect that I don't think I ever appreciated, meaning that every day people still walk up to me and will say, like, thank you for the things you're doing, because I've wanted to change this for years. And so I think that the big thing that I've seen is that there is pent up anger and pent up want for a better system, but there's a lack of a path to it. And so on one side, I've really been surprised by how open people are to the conversation, but by how frustratingly hard it is to get to the solutions that seemingly exist. My wife and I have lived abroad. We've spent time in Europe and other countries, and so you don't have to look in a crystal ball to see what the future of transportation looks like. You just need to look at Copenhagen or Amsterdam. Yet, there's something in the culture, the car culture here, that even I have been so habituated to this as being normal that I think makes it really hard that while the solutions exist, implementing them and getting sort of alignment on them seems frustratingly hard.
I want to talk more about the solutions a little later, but Fatima, you live in an area that in many ways feels like the center of car culture leading through Boston. Mm-hmm. You're in Mattapan, where a good number of commuters every day are funneling in and out of the same roads where people live, where people are trying to walk, trying to bike, trying to take the bus every day. What's your personal experience been living there?
My personal experience was that I was on my way to work. I had an early shift where I worked from 6:30 a.m. to 3:30 in the afternoon. And as I was crossing the street, a truck took a left turn. It was dark. It was raining. He didn't see me. Fortunately for me, he wasn't going he was under 20 or under 15 miles per hour. But he hit me, and I fell into the street. It just so happens I survived that one. But many people don't survive.
What do you hear from other folks living in your neighborhood?
From other folks, it's very dangerous. Most cars who actually come through my community, about 36, close to 40%, don't originate within the city of Boston. So they're coming down mainly from down Blue Hill Avenue off the highways. And they're very large vehicles for the most part. So we get a lot of semi-tractor trailers, and it's constantly all day long. So
I would like to, in a little bit, talk about the redesign of Blue Hill Avenue that's coming, because I think that gets a little bit to some of the solutions that are on the table when it comes to traffic around Boston. But Alexa, I wanted to invite you to join the conversation. Let's turn to your story. What happened to your roommate?
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, GBH, for hosting us. On June 21st, Friday morning, my roommate Minty, who I'd known for a decade, most of my life at that point, was biking down Hampshire Street in Cambridge. She was about 10 minutes behind me on the road, so I left the house about 10 minutes before her and almost got to campus where she was going to start her day for research when a truck that was driving alongside her suddenly turned right at an intersection, and she was killed when the truck hit her. So she was doing everything right. She was going straight at a green light, same with the truck. The truck was going right. And it's really jarring what happened, because for me in that moment, I actually didn't find out until later in that day when an article had already been published saying that a cyclist had been killed. So I knew that someone had died before I knew that it was my lifelong friend. And when I found out and got that call that it was her, same like Eric said, it was a nightmare moment, because I had just seen her that morning. Minty and I had been friends for most of our lives. We actually met in middle school. and did a ton of activities together in high school and stayed close. And fortunately, somehow I have the honor of being one of her longest friends that she had. Yeah.
I'm so sorry for your loss. I'm so sorry for both of your losses. Alexa, similarly to Eric, you have become an advocate in the aftermath of the loss you experienced. How are you now thinking about roads and safety for people on bikes, people walking around Boston and Massachusetts?
Yeah. At first it was scary. I could not look at a truck without thinking about who else could be hurt, who else would know the pain of having a loved one lose their life or be injured horribly because of there being a truck or a vehicle that's too large to be on the road that's right there. I think that there's a lot that can be said about driver responsibility, but at the end of the day, drivers don't want to hurt anyone. I don't believe that anyone who's driving a vehicle wants to cause harm to any of the people that they come across. And so what I really think is that we need to have better systems in place to make sure that if there is a crash, we've thought ahead of it. Like if someone is hit by a truck going right at an intersection, there's a high probability that if they get swept under that vehicle, they might lose their life under the wheels of that vehicle. And so there are devices that can help prevent that from happening. And so when I'm thinking about roads and I'm thinking about infrastructure, I'm thinking not about how we can act to prevent fatalities just from the driver and the person perspective, but how infrastructure can actually be better and how vehicles can be better and safer for everyone out there.
You mentioned the fear you experienced in the aftermath of your roommate's death. Eric, Fatima, I'm curious with both of you whether you experienced something similar when you had the moment. Fatima, in your case, when you were hit. Eric, when your daughter was. Mm-hmm. Did you feel a personal fear to be back on the streets after that?
I was on crutches for about 6 months. But I did have a fear going back to work because I was dependent upon the subway to get to work every day. And at first I had to use crutches, and I got hit where I was in the right. I waited for a light to cross, and a vehicle took an illegal left turn. They didn't see me, they just decided not to wait for the light. But as Alexa said, that a lot of times it has to do with the design of the system and what makes people's behavior do it. And that's the part to which myself and others are trying to focus on in order to change that. Because as you said, no one is trying to cause harm to someone else going to a destination. But you do have to wonder, why do we continuously build systems that don't respond to these kinds of things?
Eric, did you feel that personal sense of fear?
I mean, how could you not? The irony of the situation, though, is I know since then I've learned so much of the impact of these things is that people do feel fear and they retract from the activities that make our communities healthy. And Sid was not that way. She followed the rules and was a good user of the roads, and she did everything right, as someone else said. And so while there is that fear, I've sort of leaned away from that and believe that these are the activities that make me happier and make me a better person in my community and connecting with my community. And so I've actually, if anything, I'm more on the roads more. The ultimate irony is I was about 2 months ago, while I was riding my bike, I got hit by a pickup truck. It took my back wheel off, sent me spinning off the road. Like Fatima, I was lucky to be alive, but I remember just laying there on the side of the road, and first of all, just it was unbelievable, but thinking of Sid and thinking of how I can understand why people are afraid and why they pull back and why there's only 10% of kids now ride their bikes to school, I think is the stat. But I don't think that's okay, right? And so while I feel fear, I've really tried to lean into creating communities where these activities that give our lives richness are things that we embrace as core to who we are.
Let's talk more about solutions and turning grief and loss into action. Fatima, what are you pushing for in Mattapan, and what can you tell us about the redesign that is happening of Blue Hill Ave?
The redesign in Blue Hill Avenue is the entire streetscape. So from the time that you step outside of a building till you go into the sidewalk. If you're going to a bus, to catch a bus, or crossing over to get to the other side of the street. It's trying to make that experience as a pedestrian, as someone who rides a bike, if you're in a vehicle, all of it, that it's a whole ecosystem, that it's a community, that each action you should be able to do safely from beginning to end. And that is the push.
Alexa, in your advocacy since the death of your roommate, you've begun organizing. You've organized a ride in her honor, right? What have you been pushing for as an advocate?
Yeah, well, first, the ride that we're planning is on the World Day of Remembrance. So it's this Sunday, November 17th, and it's really inspired by a series of national rides called Ride for Your Life that actually Eric and his wife told me about a few months ago. So I just wanted to say thank you also to this entire advocacy community that's really, it's a hard club to be in, but it's really taken us all in, and I wanted to appreciate that I haven't done this on my own, so there's a whole group, there's 10 different advocacy groups who are co-sponsoring this iteration of Ride for Your Life, which is Ride for Your Life in Boston this Sunday. And so all these advocacy groups have come together because we're planning a large ride with two purposes, both to remember the people who we've lost this year in Massachusetts, but also, also, for me, there are 3 cyclists who've been killed in Cambridge alone this year. So our ride will take us past the sites of those 3 deadly crashes, and we'll end with a rally at the State House, in front of the State House in the Common here in Boston. And for me, that's 2 purposes. The purpose is really just to gather, because I think when we're mourning collectively as a community, we are all mourning, not just those who've lost loved ones. It's important to be together and to share in that, and also to turn that energy into something meaningful. And for me, that meaningful action is legislative action. So that's why we'll be at the State House.
Is it hard to be active in that way, like when you're grieving, when you've experienced loss, to try to turn it to action?
That's a very human question. And yeah, it's really hard. Doing everything is hard. Every day when I go to campus to do my research, I bike past the site where Minty was killed. But that's the way I need to go to get to work, and it's all hard, and it means that some days I'm softer to myself on the days that I need that, and some days it's hard. I think the first day I went to work, it was too hard. I left work early. I went straight to that intersection to clean up the flowers that had died. It was the middle of the summer, it was hot. And I think people have the best intentions, right, when they're trying to help, but people have the best intentions, I try to approach it with that, but when you're freshly grieving, you don't see it. All you see is your world that really, really sucks. And so I was cleaning up the dead flowers at this intersection, and a woman across the street just starts screaming at me. She says, "I think those flowers are for someone." She thought I was trying to steal flowers from this site where my friend had been killed a week before, after I'd officiated her funeral, just like 3 days before that. And it's really hard in those moments to give people grace and see where they're coming from, and see that, maybe she thought she was trying to do a good thing. But I think time has helped to give me the perspective that people do just want to help. And so time has allowed me to say, okay, we can do all this a little bit better if we appreciate that other people just want to help. And so I'm trying to come from that perspective, but some days it's harder than others.
Eric, how do you find grace in your advocacy work? You talked about how car culture is so normalized where we live, and how that's what made possible a tragedy like what happened to your daughter. How do you have grace when you're trying to work to change communities like that?
Yeah, I think that the community has held us up from the beginning. I think that's one thing that I didn't expect, is just how many, like Alexa said, it's this club you don't want to be a part of, but all of a sudden they just embrace you, and that gives you strength. Yeah, I read a quote early on in the grieving process that everybody's grief is different, but the one commonality is it wants to be heard. And I think advocacy gives you a voice to it. And so it does get heavy. There are days where I'm exhausted, but there are days where it just lifts you up, because I think we're not fighting against something where the solutions are unknown. Getting back to your question on solutions, I think the solutions are known. In Sid's case, had the truck just had some $50 convex cross-view mirrors, probably would have seen her and she'd be here. I wouldn't be here. We'd be out playing somewhere today. And so, things like the truck safety rules that are being implemented by MassDOT in January can make a meaningful difference, not only in saving lives, which we're all here to do, but also create communities where people feel safer to go out and walk and bike and roll and gather. And it comes back to, I think, this is all about community. This shouldn't be a divisive issue. This is about community, and that's what holds us up, I think, as an advocacy group, and it's what we're all fighting for.
I wanted to ask each of you before we move on to the next portion of this afternoon's event, because cars, whether we like it or not, are the norm culturally around the U.S., especially around Boston. What message you have for someone who spends every day driving to and from work and might not be thinking about everybody else's safety at every second? Fatima, I'll start with you. What's your message to drivers?
As a person who does all of it, walk, ride bikes, drive, my message would be that remember that from the time you leave your home as a pedestrian and going to your vehicle, you have a responsibility to safely navigate every street. To remember that there are people who they want to get home and get to their destination just as safely as you do. And keep that in the forefront of your mind.
Alexa?
Yeah, similar to Fatima, I also have a car and I have the privilege of driving. I like to drive and I like to bike and I like to be on public transit also and walk around. And so my message to someone who's primarily driving is to say, maybe you might like to bike too. Maybe you might like to take public transit if you can. We're really fortunate. I feel very fortunate to live in an area where I can try to have a lot of different transportation strategies. And so I might say, have you tried biking? It's really fun and it's good for you. And if you can't bike, that's fine too. But be aware of who is around you on the streets, and don't take it for granted that your car is just there for you, because it's also in an ecosystem with other people present.
I think it's just to take a step back before you have a moment like we did. Take a step back and think about the mindset when you're in a car versus other things in your life, right? Because I think we accept a level of danger when a car is involved then we would never accept at work. I think we get in a car and we accept that I could be in a deadly car crash, or someone I know could be in a deadly car crash today. I would never accept that in a work environment, right? And so I just want everyone to kind of step back and think about that, and why do we accept a different level of danger when a car is involved than almost anything else in our life. This isn't, as these guys are saying, this isn't about, I have a car. We drive because we have to, and we drive because we like it. This isn't about an anti-car thing, but it's about, are we willing to accept the carnage and the craters that it creates in our community and the backlash from it, and why?
Eric, Alexa, Fatima, thank you all so much for sharing your stories and joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Now, before we get to our next trio of guests, and as they make their way up here, I want to talk about the way that we talk about crashes. These are a couple news story headlines that highlight the way the language we use can shape our understanding of what happened in crashes. And this first one, you see traffic back to normal after bicycle crash leaves one dead. The focus here is on traffic. Disruption to people driving, not the loss of life. It's also passive. You wonder what actually killed the biker. The second headline here, 69-year-old man dies in vehicle versus bike accident. You probably noticed the use of versus. That really stuck out to me looking at this headline. Car versus bike, car versus non-car. And also the use of accident here rather than crash. It takes the onus away from what killed someone. Now let's look at some more headlines here. These are older and might be even more surprising to read. One of them is boy's death follows bike car accident. From that, you basically know nothing about the context. You might assume, yes, the boy was on a bike and was hit by a car, but the language here, the accident, it convolutes it all, and you're left wondering what happened. The next headline here is traffic mishaps claim 14 lives. And again here, people are dead, and it's due to not crashes, not cars hitting pedestrians, bicycles, or other cars, but mishaps. Next, let's look at a recent study from the journal Findings that puts into perspective the way this kind of speech may be baked into our brains. During our previous panel discussion, we were talking about car culture. And here, I think this data really puts that into sharp focus. How injuries and deaths caused by cars are the norm in the US. They're a given. Of those surveyed in this study, the vast majority said that they take it as a given that serious injury or deaths are just part of driving and having driving around. But when you ask the same question about other daily occurrences like work, of course people say serious injury should not be the norm. But again, with cars, it is. Okay, let's get right into our next panel of guests here. They join me to talk about the language we use when we talk about crashes and the loss of lives in crashes and how we can turn all of that into action. Galen Mook is the executive director of the Massachusetts Bicycle Coalition. Galen, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Christian Milneal, to my right, is the editor of StreetsBlogMA. Christian, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
And Alexa Jacob is an advocate with Critical Mass. Alexa, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So, Christian, I wanted to start by asking you about how we as journalists write about traffic and how that can shape common perceptions. Right now, we have an image that shows new AP guidance that calls for the use of crash instead of accident when writing headlines, which many advocates have said is a step in the right direction. We also have an example here of a headline you wrote, which is SUV driver kills bicyclist. Why do you think it's important to frame a crash the way that you did here?
Yeah, so I think, thanks for bringing up those other headlines. And I would say that even those are, a lot of those news clips are old. We still see that language in a lot of the police department press releases we receive as journalists, right? We see, I just got one, this week from the Mashpee Police Department where a driver killed a 92-year-old woman last Friday. But the police department reported this as an accident, and initially, it included very few details about what actually happened. And I think as a journalist and also as a writer, I think it's very important to think about and pay attention to the language that we use. I think lots of journalists are taught to be accurate and precise in their writing. But all too often, I see that goes out the window when we're reporting on crashes. I still see a lot of reporters calling these incidents accidents. And really, when you think about it, the word accident is a loaded term. It's not objective. It's making a subjective judgment that nobody's at fault. It's just kind of an oopsie. And that's not really true. There are lots of factors at play that we do have control over. Like the driver has, agency and control. They're holding a steering wheel. We have control over the way our streets are designed. So I really don't think, and I think this is why the AP changed their guidance, is that we should not be calling these accidents. These are crashes, these are homicides, they're killings, and we need to be more deliberate in the language that we use. And I think that's important so that the people who read our stories, who read about these things happen, understand that we do have control over these things and we can change. We have the agency to change them. You
mentioned the press releases that often come from law enforcement. Yeah. And a lot of the time when you are reporting stories like crashes and things that have happened like that, that's the first and sometimes only source of information you have. So how do you navigate when you are getting language like that and that's what you're relying on to report, but figuring out the best way to go forward from there?
Right, yeah. I mean, I think one of the first things we learn in journalism school is that the police are unreliable narrators and that we should often be, receiving their information with a grain of salt. But there's often a lot of other alternative ways to get information. I mean, we can go out and look at what the street looks like. So I often try to, in the case of this Mashpee crash that happened last week, I went to Google Street View and looked at, are there sidewalks on this street? There were not. There's a crosswalk, but it sort of leads to nowhere. There's an elderly housing complex nearby that also doesn't have a crosswalk. So there are lots of other details that you can glean just from looking around. And then oftentimes there are eyewitnesses. So, a few weeks ago when a driver killed John Corcoran, who's the article that you just showed up on the screen, again, there was very little information from when the crash initially happened, and initially it was not reported as a fatal crash. John later died of his injuries the next day. So it got initially relatively little attention, and then we were able to follow up with the police department to confirm that it was in fact a fatal crash. We were able to contact an eyewitness who was actually it was on a very busy bike trail on the Cambridge waterfront in the middle of rush hour. So there were lots of eyewitnesses, lots of people who were willing to talk about what happened and what they saw. So oftentimes there are lots of ways to get additional information that's not just from the police. And I think that's important because the police have a very dispassionate way of describing these things that, oftentimes strips out the humanity of what actually happened. But if you are able to find an eyewitness or a family member, like the folks who just spoke in the previous panel, that really adds so much more humanity to the story. And I think you create a much more engaging article as a reporter when you can do that.
Galen, how do you think we could better write and talk about crashes?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy, and thanks to the whole GBH team for hosting this important conversation. I think a lot of the points have been underscored of reminding the humanity of the shared responsibility of us out there on our public ways. I think it's important that we get away from the objectification. So it's not a car, it's a driver. It's not a bike, it's a person riding a bike. It's not an obstacle, it's a human who needs to do something. And I think that words matter because they get into the implicit understanding of how we are all operating in this world. We have a lot of divisions out there currently. We are seeking spaces for unity, and I think streets could be that space if we are thinking of each other as people. And when we use words like car hits bike, it is not human in the slightest. And it is important for us to work together on all fronts. And so that it is just inherent in how the police are thinking of it and how traffic engineers are thinking of it and how journalists are thinking of it. And so it is a shift of frame that we're trying to seek, which is kind of the purpose of us hosting this panel right now, to get away from verbiage that takes away and strips the empathy of the world.
Alexa, you are a human who bikes. Being an advocate also is not your day job. This is something that you decided to make a part of your life. How did you end up becoming an advocate for bicycle and traffic safety? And do you feel like a human when you're on the road on a bike?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I got started with biking in general because I was like, I'm going to train for a triathlon for some reason. And then I just kept biking because I was like, this is pretty fun. I really got my start in group rides, talking with others, and just getting that shared community around biking. Initially, I was really scared to bike in the dark, and I didn't really know how to act on the road with cars. I was living in New York City at the time. Drivers there are just as bad, if not worse, than Boston drivers. And so it definitely was a really big learning curve. How I got into advocacy is I kind of got tired of feeling dehumanized on the road, as you put it, right? Drivers don't see you as a person. They just see like, oh, this person who I have to go around, or like this obstacle, right? This happens a lot. When I'm biking around, even on my way here today, I see people running reds and I say, hey, that was a red light, and they'll curse me out. And it's like, that's not proportionate. There's laws, you gotta follow the red lights. And so I decided to get involved with advocacy because I thought, like, safe mobility is a right. I have the right to get around my community, right? I live in Somerville. I biked here today. This is how I get places. The MBT is great and all, but this is like how I choose to get around. And I think everyone has as much right to that as we all do, as drivers do, as pedestrians do. So yeah, I started organizing with Critical Mass because that's kind of the point of Critical Mass is we all move together. There's safety in numbers, and we're exercising our rights to ride bikes on the street. A lot of people will say, oh, like, don't you need a permit for this ride? Why would I get a permit for riding my bike on a public street? It's my right.
It's interesting that you brought up how triathlon training is what got you into this.
Yeah.
I was struck not too long ago when I was reading a New York Times profile of uber-rich triathlon trainers, and how one man decided that he was only going to do a stationary bike to train because he said, with the number of miles that I'm riding, statistically speaking, at some point, I'm going to have a horrible accident, and I don't want to ruin my career by biking on the road to train for triathlons. Why do you keep biking and keep advocating.
Yeah. Well, to be clear, the triathlon thing didn't end up panning out because I hate running. So like that didn't really work. But no, I mean, I keep biking because it's how I get places. Like I'll often show up to a friend's house. Like I have a friend who had a party in Waltham the other day, and I biked out there. It took me like an hour, but it was lovely. You know, it was great. I was on the Charles River bike path basically the entire way, separated from cars. It was dark out. It was nice. I had my strong lights. I was like, how do you have time to bike by yourself? So there's a lot of like good solitary biking. There's also a lot of great biking in groups. I think it's really something that brings people together. I think you have a really like shared sense of community while doing it. It's a great way to add movement into your day. It's really just the most convenient way to get around the Boston area, and I just love it so much. I could talk for hours and hours about how much I love biking and the friends that I've made through biking, and so that's what keeps me going.
Galen, I want to talk a little bit more about state and local policy surrounding bikes and pedestrians and cars. You are helping organize the annual Day of Remembrance this weekend, and you actually held a gathering at the State House today, right? To try to raise awareness with lawmakers. What do you want them to know?
That's a great question. I think we want them to know that this impacts every community. And I think the beauty of working statewide means that we are able to understand what's happening in the North Shore, what's happening in Boston, what's happening in the Berkshires, what's happening on the Cape. And this is a pervasive issue that hits not just bicyclists and people who love biking like Alexa, but every driver, every pedestrian, every person out there on our public ways is facing this challenge. And what we are working on at MassBike is to get that message to hit all 351 cities and towns, to get all the legislators, all the district attorneys, all the planners in every department to shore up and own the responsibility of solving this problem collectively. The World Day of Remembrance is an annual event. It's been going on for a better part of 2 decades, I would suppose. We at MassBike support local groups to do individual events in Pittsfield, in Methuen, in Cambridge. And MassBike, though we are small team of a nonprofit, we are hopefully providing resources and an impetus for folks to act locally. And I always kind of do a nod to Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House from way back, who used to say that all politics is local. I like to say that all biking is local. And by that I mean people really only care about what's happening on their street in their town with that one bike lane or with that crosswalk. So our goal is to make those issues relevant to the policymakers, the leaders, and the people who can make the change. And the purpose of World Day of Remembrance is to tell the stories, to tell the story of Sydney, to tell the story of Minty, to tell Fatima's story. So it's not a statistic, but there's a human understanding. Again, back to the empathy. We feel that policymakers respond best to stories. You can come with all the data that you want, but if you sit down with a legislator and you say, hey, this is what happened to my friend, can you help prevent this? They will respond, and that is what we're trying to do with World Day of Remembrance.
I reached out to the Massachusetts Department of Transportation ahead of this panel to ask them what they're doing. And according to them, they are trying to do a lot. And at the local level, like you mentioned, Galen, they have some grand plans for trying to make the roads safer for bikes, pedestrians, and cars. Christian, as someone who is tracking transportation policy and events around the state, what is happening? Are we seeing a transformation in Massachusetts?
I think it's been slow, but it is slowly shifting in the right direction. It's kind of like trying to reverse the direction of a giant tanker, right? We have a massive legacy of 20th century highway infrastructure that was built for decades without any regard for safety of pedestrians. The main focus for a long time, until relatively recently, for most traffic engineers was to move cars as quickly as possible. And pedestrians and often transit riders were often seen as obstacles to that. MassDOT has, in recent years, put into place some good policies that require the state, when they're rebuilding a roadway, to build sidewalks and crosswalks and oftentimes bike paths. But if you compare, the amount of road reconstruction that MassDOT does in any given year to the amount of roadway that there is the state, it's a very small percentage. So we're slowly, you'll see, people will probably see in their cities or their neighborhoods, there might be a state highway projects, and they might see a new sidewalk going in. But those projects are, relatively few and far between. So we're heading in the right direction, but there's still a lot of old and unsafe infrastructure out there that needs to become. overcome. And meanwhile, there are lots of other issues like, vehicles on the roadways keep on getting bigger. There are all these other issues that are, making roads less safe at the same time. So the actual, as you saw in those statistics that we showed earlier, the actual trend lines we haven't really seen many results so far, unfortunately.
We are going to be taking audience questions momentarily. There's a microphone up here, so if anybody has a question, feel free to line up near it or find my colleague Annie, who's waving her hand over there. We also have some questions from folks who are tuning in via the live stream. Before we did get to that, I wanted to quickly ask each of you, because I've been struck during this afternoon's conversation about how there are advocates for bikes. There are groups dedicated to the safety of pedestrians. You don't exactly see car advocacy groups in that same way. I mean, obviously there's the industry, and there's a long history of the car industry in the US, pushing for the way things have ended up planning wise, and for things even like the use of the word jaywalking to refer to pedestrians who cross at a given time. But I'm curious, given that, do you think that a cultural shift in the U.S. or even, specifically locally in Massachusetts and Boston is possible so that we don't remain a place where cars are at the core of our culture? I'll start with you, Galen.
I think you're peeling back a multi-layered onion here, Jeremy, for sure.
It's a big question, so
yeah.
good luck.
And I think, it is kind of getting back to the purpose of the terminology that even journalists use. I think what we're seeking is a cultural shift that happens almost innately. And I don't mean to throw shade, but using the word like you were struck, you said several times today. I'm wondering where that even comes from. It's like the ideologies of the idioms that we use go back to just kind of this autocentrality, because that is honestly the culture with which
rather than a driver hit you or a car hit you.
Yeah, exactly. We're seeking a multi-pronged approach, a systemic approach. I think Fatima had a really good line of saying, why don't we build systems that respond? And I think we are needing to shift to that direction. I'm going to remember, this is way back in the Mayor Menino administration, who was mayor of Boston for a better part of more than 20 years. When we put the first bike lane in on Com Ave, he declared, "The car is no longer king." That was a quote that came from the top down. And that is a very powerful statement in a very top-heavy city. Boston is a very mayoral-based city, so great to have that. And then similarly, we have groups like Critical Mass, which is a grassroots, very, I wouldn't call it anarchistic, but not necessarily centralized, from the bottom up. And I think we need to work, we've got those. We've got the policies set, and we've got the grassroots. Now, how do we really kind of merge that to get to the middle? And I think we have a long way to go. We have a long way to go until we understand that the street is a public way for everybody. Whether or not there's a sidewalk, you are allowed to be there as a person. You do not need to be in a vehicle to be on a roadway. It is a public way except for very few limited access highways. And that is kind of a purpose of where I'm hoping this conversation will lead, is that every driver, every biker, every walker, everybody who's on a horse is out there on our roadways is understood that you should be there, but so should everybody else. And getting back to that kind of commonality, that empathy, and it's okay that I'm in your way or that you're in my way, because you belong here just as much as I belong here. Now, does that mean that we need to dethrone a king? I'm not so sure about that, but if the mayor says so, the mayor says so. So there is that. But I do want to say, from a policy standpoint, one of the biggest things that we were able to do was designate vulnerable users on our roadway. It's a new designation in Massachusetts state law. It's a protected class, in essence, of people who are allowed to be on our roadway. And we can build regulations and policies off of that, which hopefully have the effect of education and infrastructure and behavior. But the goal is, again, to get down to the understanding that regardless of what device you're on, or even if it's just shoes, you are supposed to be on our public way and should have the human right and the civil right to be there safely.
We actually do have an audience question written in about the vulnerable users of the road, so I will be very curious to hear your answer about that. I'd love to get to some of the audience questions we have in person here, so we have someone approaching the microphone. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ron from Somerville, probably a neighbor of Alexa's. And my question is, what effect, if any, do you expect the forthcoming change in federal administrations to have on everything you're talking about?
Christian?
That might be a Galen question.
I'm not going to speculate. Maybe
I don't know. We've got a great state. We have some great leaders. I just came from the State House from an event earlier today. We can do what we can do here. I'm a big fan of Secretary Buttigieg in Washington. I think he's set a great course. There's going to be a lot of federal employees who might need new jobs, and we're happy to take them. Let's get them in, let's get them employed, let's get them working. And like I say, all biking is local, all politics is local. Transportation is regional, but you get my point. Let's put them to play here.
Yeah. I think this kind of relates to what your question right beforehand about, like, you know, what is the sort of car lobbying, car lobbyists, what would they say about all this? I think a lot of car drivers are also really worried about safety, and legitimately so, because if you actually look at the raw numbers, the most people dying on our roadways are people in cars, right? People on, you know, Interstate 93 and big highways. So if you go to any public meeting in Massachusetts, you know, safety issues, road safety is a huge constituent issue for everyone, for every elected official, no matter where you live, no matter who your elected, you know, leaders are, Republican or Democrat. They're hearing from constituents that they want safer streets. Their, constituents are dying, no matter whether they're, you know, driving cars or, you know, walking on a city sidewalk. So I think this is a, you know, nonpartisan issue, frankly, and. So we'll see what happens next, but I think car drivers are also legitimately very concerned about these issues.
Thank you very much for the question. We also had several questions written in to us in advance of this event about the 4 feet law that requires motorists to pass a vulnerable road user, like you were mentioning, Galen, a bike, a pedestrian, someone on a scooter, at a, quote, safe passing distance of at least 4 feet. One viewer, Robin, wonders if AAA can take a more prominent role in raising awareness. Dee asked us, besides a small flyer inside of our license renewal mailer, how is the 4-foot rule taught and enforced? And I reached out to the Department of Transportation for comments on this. They said, quote, they provided signs to all communities that requested them and to each of MassDOT's 6 district offices. A total of nearly 5,000 signs were delivered to communities around the Commonwealth. But I'm curious, from both of your experiences, Alexa and Galen, as bikers, as often vulnerable road users, do you feel like people are educated about this, or how better do you think we could educate Massachusetts on it?
I would say they're not educated at all. This is like the number one thing that happens to me when I'm biking on city streets is like someone passes me way too close and I say, hey, it's 4 feet, and sometimes they flip me off, right? And it's like, well, that's not very respecting everyone's humanity. But I think that MassBike has great bumper stickers about this, like, 4 feet, it's the law. But I think a lot of this is going to come down to enforcement. Like, I saw a take after this law passed that its main utility is, God forbid there's a crash, like if this vulnerable road user got passed by less than 4 feet, like that could be an insurance thing, right? They weren't following the law, and so there's different implications to that. I would like to see more done in terms of prevention. Obviously, this is a really big step towards like road safety, but I don't think it's going to go very far without enforcement.
Galen?
I kind of have a different take, and I think we advocated very strongly for this law at MassBike, and I think our purpose was to prevent the crash from happening and mitigate the need for enforcement. I mean, we're not expecting police officers to be out there with tape measures, right? But the idea that we can get this into the mindset of a driver that there is a minimum that people feel safe at, which is 4 feet. And I think that is very new. The law's only been around really in effect since last April. We at MassBike are working to get this into driver's ed training. We're building new modules that will go into every driving school throughout the state. As you mentioned, there are more than 5,000 signs up. For all you listeners, you probably have them in your municipality. You might see them up. It says motorists must give 4 feet. But I think the important thing about this is that there is a difference between the motorist must give 4 feet versus they share the road sign, which I think we're all familiar with as well. One, the share the road is ambiguous as to whom's sharing with whom. Whereas the motorists must give puts an onus of responsibility. And that is a huge change, in my opinion, a sea change of how we're designating our legislation, because those who have the greatest power to do damage also have the greatest responsibility to provide space and make others feel safe. And I've heard, oh, does that mean bikers have to give 4 feet when they're passing pedestrians? I'm like, no, we're still legally required to ring a bell or say on your left, which arguably doesn't happen all that much on the Esplanade, but still. But again, it's a relative nature of where the actual danger lies. And if you're a driver, you will be taught, especially a new driver. And if you're a current driver, you will be informed with signage. And hopefully, again, it's relatively new, we are kind of shifting the needle away from that share the road mentality, but there is a responsibility for those of you who are driving. And I drive, of course, I work statewide, I drive all the time. And I have a very cautious take because arguably I understand the human impact that can be made by me driving dangerously. So I think that's the important part of it, is that it is putting a action on those who have the ability to both be the danger, but also can then change their behavior or modify their behavior to make others feel safe.
Thanks to the viewers who wrote in with those questions. I want to go to the next question from our live audience here at the Newsfeed Cafe.
Hi, my name is Roger Woodbury from Beverly, Massachusetts, and a lot of what you were just talking about has to do with the questions I was going to ask. I think a culture shift is really important. The laws are important, but laws get broken. People make mistakes. Good people make mistakes. And I originally planned to come here because we lost a family friend a couple of years ago in a car, in a truck bicycle crash. And last week, I myself was in a crash. And the driver was in a hurry, did not know the rules of the road, and saw me as an obstacle in the road that had to be passed. And the driver illegally passed me, and there was a collision. So my question is, how does education have a broader reach than first-time drivers, that sort of thing? The driver was an elderly person and had been driving probably all their life on roads in Massachusetts, but came from a different era where the culture was different.
Yeah. Thank you for the question and for sharing your story. Galen, Alexa?
I'll say the onus is on kind of all of us here, from the media side of things, from the community side of things. If you're part of the Beverly Bike Committee, you can get out there and work with your local electeds to make a message happen, which I know you are. And this again, I think, is a collective need that is not just the responsibility of a driving school or a sign. This is something that we all need to work towards. It needs to infuse its way into how we are understanding how our shared space on our public ways operates, which could mean infrastructure changes. Older drivers who aren't familiar with bike lanes, the bike lane changes, specifically in the city of Boston, I'm confused sometimes by seeing some stuff pop up. And it's a hard modification to change habitual behavior, and I think it's not easy. I don't know if I have an answer for you, Roger, but besides to say that we all have work to do, and a lot of it does come down to messaging. So if anything that you can do locally within Beverly, and anything that we can do at MassBike to provide, for instance, as Alexa mentioned, like those bumper stickers, the signage, the classes, this is a all hands on deck movement right now.
Well, quickly before we get to the next audience question, Alexa, I wanted to ask you your personal experience, because where we are at the Boston Public Library, there have been new bike lanes added on Boylston Street. They have parking, essentially putting a barrier between the cars on the road and where the bike lane is. From your experience, do things like that help a lot? And do you think the need for a culture, attitude, or knowledge shift can be avoided if the infrastructure is there and cars are separated from bikes?
Well, I think it has to go both ways, right? You have to have the culture shift and you have to have the infrastructure shift. And those two go hand in hand, right? When people see more bike lanes, they are happier about them, right? Like when you have a bike lane and people use it, they realize how great it is, and they usually stop complaining about it at that point. A lot of people learn to love biking through that. I find the parking protected bike lanes are great. It's like, two birds, one stone. You can protect the bike lane with parking. There's a big barrier between the bikes and the cars that are driving, and drivers are always concerned about loss of parking whenever they put in bike lanes. So it really is like a double whammy. I think I'm really encouraged on the realm of culture change. I live near an elementary school, and I see a lot of parents bringing their kids to school in cargo bikes these days, and I think that's really the gold standard. When parents feel comfortable enough bringing their kids on the road, or having the kid on a bike in front of them or whatever, I think that's really how we know that we have safer streets, or safe enough streets. So I think the infrastructure needs to change. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the infrastructure, but I'm really encouraged by both the infrastructure improvements and the cultural changes that are happening.
Let's go to our next question from our live audience at the Boston Public Library.
Thank you. I'm John Allen. I'm from Waltham, and I'm former president of the organization MassBike that Galen works for now. I have a couple of comments specifically about the last thing said, that 2 of the 3 bicyclists who were killed in Cambridge, including your friend, were killed entering intersections from what are called protected bike lanes, because the protection ends at the intersections. And I'm not sure exactly what happened in either of these crashes, but there can be there is definitely the need to look over one's shoulder and see if the truck is about to arrive. But I have a more general issue. I'm glad to hear that police were mentioned earlier. I'd like to hear some discussion of state police reporting of bicycle crashes. I keep track of these to the degree I can. I can say without any doubt, and I work as a bicycle crash reconstruction expert, that the Amanda Phillips crash in 2016, state police report used altered video evidence. And this has been bugging me for a long time. I've had a hard time getting traction on this, but it's when I see the Globe coming up with this woman who is an imposter. Oh, well, that's too bad. But this woman was killed, and then the blame was placed on her. And there are other examples of bad reporting and blame shifting, although not as egregious. So thank you.
Thank you for the question. And it was a little bit quiet, so if anybody didn't hear, the question was essentially surrounding the way that state police report crashes and how that informs the way that we as journalists can report on them and talk about this. Galen, I want to hear from you in a second, because I know you've pushed for some changes about how crashes are reported and what information we get. But Christian, first from you, what's your experience and what you can get and what you hear from state police surrounding crashes of bicycles and pedestrians?
Yeah, so the state police are often brought in crash investigations, especially when it's a fatal crash. And they're always brought in when it's a crash that's on a state roadway. So Memorial Drive, the crash that killed John Corcoran a couple weeks ago, that was a state roadway. I actually got a phone call after I published that story from the state police spokesperson, a fellow named Tim McGurk, objecting to my use of the word homicide in that story. I think police do get defensive when we do use accurate language like this, and I think it kind of puts them on the spot. I think the reason he was defensive is that because I was not framing this as just an accident. I was framing this as somebody drove onto the sidewalk and struck this victim. And since then, we've done a follow-up story talking about how the driver in that crash still has not been arrested. They did have their license suspended, but it's a very weak deterrent. There are lots of drivers who still continue to drive with a suspended license. So there are folks who are concerned that this person might still be driving, might still be out there, and that is a legitimate public safety concern. And when I called for a follow-up, again to Tim McGurk, and asked him, aren't you concerned that this driver might still be out there? He got very defensive again and said, I think that's a really unfair question. That's a direct quote. I think one of the reasons that police use this very impersonal language and use language like accident is that it doesn't just deflect responsibility from the driver, it also deflects responsibility in their own responsibility as police to keep us safe. And frankly, I don't think it's really possible for police to keep us safe the way our roadways are designed, the way people drive. We can pass all the laws we want, but as people have noted, like drivers break laws every time they get in the car, right? I think the way, and then this, every state police investigation takes months and months, so it's going to be a very long time before we get the official report on what happened, which also, sort of dilutes the responsibility and the urgency of making changes here. So I would love the state police to be more proactive. I would love investigations to be more open and transparent. But I think that's going to be a struggle.
Galen, MassBike has been instrumental in pushing for changes that require like the make and model of cars involved in crashes to be reported. What else needs to happen?
Yeah, it's a tricky problem too. This is part of our Act to Reduce Traffic Fatalities bill that got signed into law, which is the same as the 4-foot passing and the vulnerable road users and truck side guards. It was a bundle package that was geared towards really all that we could get through the legislature at the time to make our roads safer. And one of the key elements is, are we doing well? Are we tracking data that will show the efficacy of the work? And we have really poor practice of consistent data across the state. All the different police departments have different forms. They sometimes would report them as single car crashes when it was a bike crash, or sometimes bicyclists were reported as pedestrians. If there was no damage to report, sometimes the police wouldn't even make a report. So we, as part of our efforts, and it wasn't just MassBike, I should say, this is part of the Vision Zero Coalition, which includes organizations like Walk Massachusetts, which I think I'll give credit to this node of, they advocated to get the make and model, the VIN number of all vehicles, which can be now added into the Mass DOT public portal. So if anybody wants to be a data nerd, you're able to go through and pull all of that, and you can say, okay, are the larger vehicles responsible for more crashes or more dangerous crashes or more severe crashes? And now we can start to get that data. The law just went into effect last year, so we have a little bit of ways to really do the analysis. Unfortunately, it's going to be retroactive because it's responsive and not preventative. However, I think it's a very important marker to say whether we as society are doing what we need to Christian's point of making our streets safe. But I do want to speak for a second on the police response, though, is that the idea that the police are also kind of responding to protecting their cities, their towns, their planners, their society, which they know it. And I think that is kind of coming through in a lot of police reports because they see the world from behind the windshield for the most part. They can understand a driver who doesn't see a pedestrian in a crosswalk because of solar glare, because they've been there. However, that shouldn't excuse them from making a citation. If a driver strikes somebody in a crosswalk, that's a clear violation of the law, whether or not the sun was shining or not. I think that is an important marker to say that there is a lot of human error. Error is maybe the wrong word, a human input that goes into whether or not citations move forward. And that's just the nature of who we are as humans.
I see we have a number of other questions in the audience. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of our panel discussion time. We actually, I think we can do one more, and then after this, folks, we're gonna have no more time for audience questions. But after the panel ends, our panelists will hopefully be sticking around, and we do have some time left at the library. So if you want to have discussion, stick around afterwards. I unfortunately won't be able to. I have to pick up my kid from daycare, but keep the discussion going after this, and let's get in one more audience question here.
Charlotte Simpson. I live in the Back Bay, and as a pedestrian, I'm used to one or maybe two cars running a light. What I'm not used to is bikes going the wrong way, bikes running the light at any time, scooters going the wrong way. I'd like to know what the plan is for protecting pedestrians, and I'm not interested in waiting for a cultural change for this to happen.
Thank you very much for the question. And this also gets to something else. I was talking to a transportation expert in Germany where they were talking about how with the introduction of e-bikes also they've seen a large increase in crashes, both with bikes and with pedestrians. Galen, as head of the MassBike Coalition, what do you say to someone who's saying pedestrians are getting hurt from bicyclists who aren't following the rules?
Yeah, fully heard and understood. We have a lot of work to do. I think part of it is I want to be clear that this World Day of Remembrance and what we're marking now is not, especially for my organization, it's not for bicyclists. It's really for all traffic crashes. And as Christian mentioned, a lot of these are people who are just driving motor vehicles too. And that's the first and foremost where these serious injuries and deadly crashes happen. But that is not to negate the dangers and fears of crossing a street as a pedestrian. A lot of it is we are forcing a lot of modes to share not a lot of space. And we are new in this city, particularly about having some of this new infrastructure and these new devices. We don't have a system of enforcement. We don't really have a system of separation. So it is, unfortunately, a bit of let's throw it all together and see what happens. My opinion is that we don't have time for infrastructure change to tackle some of these problems. A lot of it could be with education, which in my opinion is the lowest of the hanging fruit, of getting the messaging out and stopping folks in advance of them making the problem. And I welcome support. I don't think I have an answer, but I recognize that the problem exists, and I think we, again, need to kind of all work together with all the tools, long and short term, to address this. This is a really sticky one.
We'll have to leave it there. Galen, Alexa, Christian, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you, Jeremy.
us.
Thank you, everybody at GBH, for hosting this.
And thank you to everybody who joined us here at the library. Thank you to everybody who joined via our live stream. This evening was made possible by the GBH Forum Network. I'm Jeremy Siegel. Thank you so much for joining us, and everybody, please have a great night.